Dr. Jasmine Miller, a brilliant maternal health specialist, a black woman 8 months pregnant, and a voice for countless others who've been told they don't belong. On what should have been an ordinary flight to deliver a keynote speech, a moment she had worked her entire life to achieve, Jasmine is stopped in her tracks. The airline claims it's about policy, about safety, about comfort. But Jasmine knows the truth runs deeper. Humiliated, dismissed, and forced to stand alone, Jasmine faces a choice: turn away quietly, like so many before her, or fight back. With the unexpected help of Langston Avery, a retired attorney with a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of justice, Jasmine begins a battle she never asked for one against a giant corporation determined to silence her. But as the walls close in, secrets unravel. A quiet injustice reveals itself to be a pattern, a system designed to keep some people in and others out. What follows is a journey of courage, resilience, and determination as Jasmine turns her pain into power and challenges a world that underestimated her strength. The soft hum of the car's engine was Jasmine Miller's only companion as she sat in the back seat of a rideshare, gazing out at the early morning city skyline. Buildings rose like giants against a sky, turning from gray to soft gold. This was her home, New York City, vibrant, busy, alive. Yet on this day, the city's energy felt distant. Jasmine was focused on a singular task: catching her flight. The airport awaited her, and beyond that, the conference she had dreamed about for years. It was the type of conference where careers soared, where opportunities expanded, where her voice as a doctor, as a researcher, as a black woman in medicine would be heard. She was 8 months pregnant, yes, but Jasmine never let obstacles stop her. Not when she worked long shifts through residency, not when she balanced her work with volunteering at free clinics, and certainly not now. "Big day, huh?" the driver asked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. Jasmine smiled politely, her hand resting protectively over her rounded belly. "Yes, big day." The man nodded, as if sensing her focus. The rest of the ride passed in silence. Jasmine entered the terminal, pulling her small carry-on suitcase behind her. The airport was alive with movement families juggling kids and strollers, business travelers hurrying with laptops in hand, vacationers beaming with excitement. Overhead, announcements crackled over the speakers, gate changes, boarding calls, reminders about security. She adjusted her tote bag over her shoulder and walked with deliberate steadiness. Each step mattered. At 8 months pregnant, even simple movements felt heavy and calculated, as though her body were carrying the weight of her future along with her child. She didn't mind. Jasmine had always carried more than most expectations, responsibilities, dreams. When she reached the airline's check-in counter, Jasmine paused to catch her breath. The counter attendant was a slim woman with sharp features, her hair pulled into a tight bun beneath her polished cap. Her name tag read, M. Kelly. "Good morning," Jasmine greeted, sliding her ID and boarding pass across the counter. She flashed her most professional smile. "I'm checking in for Flight 218 to Chicago." Kelly barely looked up. "Just a moment." Her fingers clattered across the keyboard as she searched through the reservation system. The line behind Jasmine grew longer. People sighed impatiently, the subtle tension of busy mornings radiating through the space. Jasmine tried not to notice. Instead, she ran through her speech in her head. Start with the new data on maternal mortality rates, connect it to policy changes, then conclude with patient-centered care. She knew it perfectly, but rehearsing kept her grounded. "Excuse me, ma'am." Kelly's voice broke through Jasmine's thoughts, sharper now. "Are you traveling alone?" "Yes," Jasmine replied, frowning slightly. "Why?" Kelly looked her up and down with a glance that lingered far too long, as though Jasmine were a problem to solve. "We have policies for passengers exceeding certain weight requirements. For your comfort and safety, you may need to purchase an additional seat." Jasmine blinked, confused. I am well within your guidelines. I checked before I booked. Policies change, Kelly replied curtly. For your size and condition, it's standard. Jasmine stiffened, her pulse quickening. My size? She glanced around as if expecting someone to confirm that she had heard wrong. I'm pregnant, not... Ma'am, the policy applies regardless of reason. Kelly cut her off, her tone louder, drawing glances from people waiting in line. The murmurs began immediately soft whispers. Jasmine could feel like pinpricks against her skin. She's too pregnant to fly. Why wouldn't she buy another seat? Maybe she should have thought about this. Jasmine's face burned as she stood there, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. She inhaled deeply, willing herself to stay calm. I have a letter from my doctor clearing me to travel. My weight meets your requirements. I booked an aisle seat specifically for comfort. I do not need to purchase another ticket. Kelly's lips pursed, her expression unchanging. The policy is clear, and I cannot make exceptions. For the first time in years, Jasmine felt her confidence waver. She was used to solving problems, medical emergencies, surgeries under pressure, difficult patients. But this felt different, personal, degrading. I want to speak to your manager, Jasmine said, keeping her voice firm but steady. Kelly crossed her arms and sighed. I am following company protocol, ma'am. If you'd like, I can process a refund for your ticket. Otherwise, I'll have to ask you to step aside. Jasmine's heart pounded. A refund. She couldn't miss this flight. She couldn't miss the conference. She had earned her place there. She had worked for this moment. I need to board that plane, Jasmine said, more to herself than to Kelly. But Kelly had already turned to the next passenger, dismissing her completely. Jasmine stepped back, stunned. The humiliation weighed on her chest like a boulder. Around her, people averted their eyes or glanced at her with curiosity. A few offered sympathetic smiles, but no one said a word. No one intervened. She moved toward a row of empty chairs near a window and sank into one, her body heavy with exhaustion. Outside, planes taxied across the tarmac, their engines roaring a sound that usually made her feel hopeful, like a world of possibilities lay beyond the runway. Today, it felt mocking. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her best friend, Lauren. Safe flight, Jazz. You'll do amazing. Baby Miller is already proud of you. Love you. Jasmine stared at the screen, her vision blurring as tears welled in her eyes. How could she explain this to anyone? That the airline had looked at her body, her strong, capable body, and decided she didn't belong? For the first time, Jasmine felt small. Excuse me, miss? The voice startled her. She looked up to see a man standing nearby. He was older, with salt and pepper hair and a crisp navy blazer. His expression was gentle, though his sharp eyes hinted at someone who had seen his fair share of battles. Can I help you with something? The man asked, his voice kind but steady. Jasmine hesitated. She didn't know this man. Why would he care? I'm fine, she murmured, brushing away the moisture gathering at the corners of her eyes. It's just... She trailed off, her voice failing her. The man tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. I saw what happened back there, he said quietly. It wasn't right. Jasmine's defenses kicked in. You don't understand. Maybe I do, he replied. He gestured to the seat beside her. May I? After a moment's pause, Jasmine nodded, and the man sat down, leaving a respectful distance between them. My name is Langston Avery, he said. I used to be an attorney, civil rights cases mostly. Jasmine looked at him, skepticism flashing in her eyes. Why do you care about what happened to me? Because I've seen this before, Langston replied. I know what it looks like when companies hide behind policies to treat people unfairly. Jasmine studied him for a long moment. Something about his calm demeanor put her at ease, even as doubt lingered. I don't know what to do, she admitted finally, her voice low. I just wanted to board my flight. Langston's expression softened, but there was a fire in his eyes, a quiet determination that seemed to spark something in Jasmine too. You have more power than you think, he said, and if you're willing to fight, I'd like to help you. Jasmine felt a flicker of something hope, maybe. She had spent so long advocating for others, but who would advocate for her? She looked at Langston and saw something she hadn't seen in the airport staff, the passengers, or the attendants, a willingness to stand with her. Okay, Jasmine said softly, almost to herself. She straightened in her chair, resting a hand on her belly. Where do we start? Langston smiled faintly. First, we get the facts. Then we make sure they can't ignore you. Outside the window, a plane rose into the sky, its wings cutting through the morning sun. Jasmine watched it climb, and for the first time that day, she felt like she might rise too. Jasmine sat across from Langston Avery in the quiet corner of the airport terminal, the chaos of the morning swirling around them like an invisible storm. Her breathing had steadied, but the humiliation lingered. Her heart still felt raw from the incident at the counter. Langston opened the sleek leather briefcase he had carried in one hand, pulling out a slim notepad and pen. Every movement was deliberate, calm, and precise, like he had done this 100 times before. Let's start with what happened, he said gently, clicking the pen. I need you to tell me everything you can remember, word for word if possible. Jasmine hesitated, her hands resting protectively on her belly. How had it come to this? Just a few hours ago, her biggest concern was practicing her opening remarks for the conference. Now she was sitting in an airport, recounting how a stranger had stripped her of her dignity in front of a line of impatient travelers. I don't know how much it'll matter, she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Langston looked at her, his expression steady, but not unkind. It matters. Trust me. Something about the way he said it, with quiet conviction, gave Jasmine the strength to begin. Her name tag said McKelly, she said. The attendant, she barely looked at me when I handed over my ID, just typed on her keyboard, then started asking about my size. What did she say exactly? Langston prompted, his pen gliding smoothly across the page. Jasmine swallowed hard, replaying the moment in her mind. The words still stung. She said their policy required passengers above a certain weight to buy an extra seat. She used those exact words. Langston's eyes narrowed slightly, but he only nodded for her to continue. I told her I met their guidelines, Jasmine said, a slight tremor in her voice. I checked everything before I booked the flight. I wasn't breaking any rules. And then? She didn't care, Jasmine said, bitterness creeping into her tone. She just talked louder, like she wanted everyone to hear, like I was some kind of problem she needed to fix. Langston's pen stilled for a moment as he looked up at her. And did anyone else step in? Jasmine shook her head, her throat tightening. No. People just stared. Some of them whispered, but no one said a word to her. I felt... She paused, searching for the right word. Invisible. Or worse, like I wasn't supposed to be there at all. Langston gave her a long, searching look. He didn't speak right away, which was somehow more comforting than if he had offered hollow reassurances. He simply let her words sit between them, giving them weight. Humiliation has a way of making us question ourselves, Langston said quietly, finally breaking the silence. But what happened to you wasn't your fault, Dr. Miller. Hearing him say her name, her full title, brought a small measure of comfort. She was not just some anonymous face to him. She was someone with a name, a purpose, a life that mattered. What do we do now? Jasmine asked, her voice still soft but steadier now. Langston tapped the edge of his notepad thoughtfully. We start with the facts. The details matter because airlines like this rely on people walking away. They count on you feeling too ashamed or powerless to push back. Jasmine's brow furrowed. But how do you know so much about this? A shadow passed across Langston's face, brief but unmistakable. Let's just say I've seen my share of cases where power was abused. Airline discrimination is subtler than most people realize, but it's still discrimination. Subtler? Jasmine repeated, her voice sharp with frustration. There was nothing subtle about what happened to me. You're right, Langston agreed, his voice calm. But they'll claim it was just policy. That's how they get away with it. They hide behind words like comfort and safety while enforcing guidelines that don't hold up under scrutiny. Jasmine exhaled slowly, feeling the exhaustion creeping up on her again. She glanced out the window, where planes taxied back and forth, taking people to their destinations, people who, unlike her, had not been made to feel small or unwelcome. Langston followed her gaze, his expression thoughtful. "Tell me something," he said after a moment. "What were you flying to Chicago for?" The question caught Jasmine off guard. She looked back at him, surprised, then down at her hands resting on her belly. "I was going to speak at a medical conference," she said. "I'm a maternal health specialist. My research focuses on reducing mortality rates for Black women during pregnancy and childbirth." Langston's expression shifted, softening in a way Jasmine hadn't expected. "That's important work," he said simply. "Work that matters." Jasmine nodded, the words tightening something deep in her chest. "It is," she said. "That's why I can't miss this conference. I've worked so hard to get here. I can't let them take this away from me." "They won't," Langston replied firmly. "We're going to fight this." Jasmine looked at him, skepticism warring with the hope she could feel rising despite herself. "How?" "Step by step," Langston said. "First, we document everything what happened, who was there, and what the policy actually says. Then we find people who can back up your story, witnesses, employees, maybe even people who have gone through the same thing." Jasmine frowned. "You think I'm not the only one?" "I know you're not," Langston said, his voice steady. "Airlines don't develop these policies overnight. It's part of a pattern. And if we can prove that pattern exists, they won't be able to brush you off." Jasmine felt her pulse quicken again, not from anger or humiliation this time, but from something else entirely. "Resolve. I don't even know if anyone will help us," she said quietly, but there was less doubt in her voice now. Langston gave her a small, knowing smile. "Sometimes help comes from the places you least expect." The sound of approaching footsteps drew their attention. Jasmine turned to see a woman walking toward them. It was one of the other airline employees, someone she had noticed earlier at the neighboring counter. She was young, with wide, uncertain eyes and dark hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. "Excuse me," the woman said hesitantly, glancing around as though making sure no one saw her. "Are you the woman from earlier?" Jasmine straightened, unsure what to say. "Yes," she replied cautiously. The woman glanced at Langston, then back to Jasmine. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened. It wasn't right, and you're not the first." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The woman swallowed hard, her gaze darting nervously over her shoulder. "I work at the counter next to Kelly. I've seen her do this before to other passengers, mostly pregnant women or people who look a certain way." Langston leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Would you be willing to say that in writing?" The woman hesitated, her hands twisting together anxiously. "I don't want to lose my job. I can't." "You don't have to," Langston assured her. "We won't ask you to do anything that puts you at risk, but if you ever change your mind..." He handed her a small business card. "Call me." The woman took the card, her expression conflicted. "I just wanted you to know," she said quietly, meeting Jasmine's eyes. "You're not imagining this. You didn't do anything wrong." Jasmine felt her throat tighten again, but this time, It wasn't from humiliation. It was something else, gratitude, maybe, mixed with the faintest flicker of hope. "Thank you," Jasmine said softly, her voice barely audible. The woman nodded once, then turned and hurried away, disappearing into the crowd. Jasmine looked at Langston, who was watching her with quiet satisfaction. "What did I tell you?" he said, his lips quirking into a faint smile. "Sometimes help comes when you least expect it." Jasmine exhaled slowly, the weight of the morning beginning to lift just a little. "So, what's next?" Langston picked up his pen and notepad again, determination etched into every line of his face. "Next, we build a case they can't ignore." Jasmine nodded, her resolve hardening like steel. She wasn't sure where this road would lead, but for the first time that day, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't backing down. Jasmine sat in the stiff plastic chair near the large terminal window, her gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the tarmac. The woman's words still echoed in her mind. "You didn't do anything wrong." That single sentence, simple yet powerful, felt like a salve on the raw wound left by Kelly's dismissal. Beside her, Langston adjusted his glasses, jotting down notes in his small leather notebook. His movements were methodical, as if he were piecing together a puzzle in his mind. It struck Jasmine how unshakable he seemed. She couldn't decide if that steadiness came from experience or simply who he was. "You're quiet," Langston said without looking up, his pen still moving. Jasmine turned to face him. "I guess I'm still processing everything." Langston finally paused, resting his pen against the notebook's spine. "That's fair. Something like this, it's not easy to shake off, especially when you're not used to people treating you this way." "I'm a doctor," Jasmine said softly, as if trying to remind herself. "I've spent my entire life helping people. That woman didn't even see me as a person." Langston regarded her thoughtfully. "That's because people like her don't care who you are or what you've done. They see what they want to see." He leaned forward slightly, his voice firm but kind. "But how you see yourself, that's what matters." Jasmine looked down, letting his words settle. She had spent years defining herself through her work, her achievements, her ability to overcome every obstacle placed in her path. But today felt different. Today, she had been reduced to nothing more than a number, a shape, an inconvenience. "I just don't understand how this is allowed to happen," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "Policies like these shouldn't exist." "They exist because no one challenges them," Langston replied. "Most people don't have the energy or resources to fight back. They're tired, they're embarrassed, or they just want to move on with their lives." Jasmine swallowed hard, her hand instinctively moving to rest on her belly. But what happens if no one fights? What happens when they do it to someone else? Langston's expression softened, and a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Now you're asking the right questions." Langston stood, gathering his things. "Come on," he said. "Let's take a walk." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "A walk?" "You've been sitting here stewing long enough," Langston said. "Let's get some air, or as close as we can to air in an airport." Reluctantly, Jasmine pushed herself to her feet. Her body was heavy, and her back protested the movement. But the idea of sitting in silence any longer felt unbearable. She followed Langston down the long corridor, past crowded gates and clusters of travelers. As they walked, Jasmine noticed things she hadn't before: families sharing snacks, teenagers scrolling on their phones, couples quietly laughing as they leaned against each other. The world kept moving, indifferent to what had happened to her. It was both comforting and isolating. Langston led her to a quieter section of the terminal, where rows of unused gates stretched into the distance. Here, the noise was subdued, the activity a faint hum in the background. He gestured toward a bench and sat down. Jasmine lowered herself beside him with a relieved sigh. "I want you to know something," Langston said, looking straight ahead. "This fight won't be easy. People like Kelly, her managers, their lawyers, they'll do everything they can to justify what happened. Jasmine nodded slowly. You think they'll come after me? Langston turned to look at her, his sharp gaze steady. Maybe, but that's what they count on. They want you to feel intimidated, to back down before you even begin. That's how they win. Jasmine clenched her hands in her lap. I don't want to back down, she said quietly. Not this time. Langston smiled faintly. Good. The quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Jasmine turned to see the same young woman from earlier, Claire, walking toward them, her expression tense. Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. Why is she coming back? Claire stopped a few feet away, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Can I sit? Langston gestured to the bench. Of course. Claire sat on the edge of the seat, her hands gripping her phone tightly. She hesitated for a long moment, clearly battling with herself. Finally, she looked at Jasmine. I wanted to say something earlier, but... She trailed off, her voice barely audible. I couldn't. It's okay, Jasmine said softly. Claire took a shaky breath. What Kelly did, it wasn't right, and she's done it before. I've worked with her for 2 years, and I've seen her target people who look like you. Women, mostly. Pregnant women, bigger women, black women. She looked down at her hands. She knows how to twist the policy to get what she wants. Jasmine felt a wave of anger rise in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. Does management know? Claire hesitated again, then nodded. They do. There have been complaints, but nothing ever changes. People just stop pushing, or they take the refund and leave. Langston leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. Would you be willing to share that in writing? Claire looked panicked. I don't know. I can't lose my job. I'm barely making ends meet as it is. Langston's tone softened. I understand the risk, and we won't ask you to do anything that puts you in danger. But people like Kelly keep doing this because no one challenges them. If someone doesn't speak up, it'll never stop. Jasmine looked at Claire, seeing the younger woman's fear and hesitation. She wanted to reassure her, to tell her she understood, but the words felt hollow. Claire chewed on her lip, clearly torn. Finally, she nodded, just slightly. I'll think about it, she whispered. But I can tell you this. If you want to prove what Kelly's doing, check the passenger complaints. There's a system where we log every policy incident. I've seen her name on a lot of them. Langston's eyes lit up. Thank you, Claire, he said. That helps more than you know. Claire stood quickly, glancing around the empty corridor. I should get back, she murmured. Good luck. Jasmine watched her go, a mixture of gratitude and sadness settling in her chest. Claire was trying to help, but she was stuck in her own battles, her own fears. She's brave, Langston said quietly, as if reading Jasmine's thoughts. Jasmine nodded. She is. As they sat in the silence that followed, Jasmine let herself exhale for what felt like the first time all day. Langston had already started scribbling notes in his notebook again, his focus unwavering. Do you really think we can win this? Jasmine asked suddenly. Langston didn't look up, but his voice was steady. I do. Jasmine looked out the window at another plane lifting off, its wings cutting through the afternoon sky. Somewhere deep inside, she felt the smallest flicker of hope that this fight was worth it, that what she had been through might change something for someone else. Langston finally set down his pen and met her gaze. This is just the first step, Dr. Miller, he said with a small smile. But it's the most important one. Jasmine rested a hand on her belly, her resolve hardening like steel. We fight, she said quietly, for all the people who couldn't. Langston nodded. We fight. The afternoon sun filtered through the wide terminal windows, casting long golden streaks across the floor as Jasmine sat back in her chair. Her conversation with Claire lingered in her mind, leaving a quiet buzz of energy she couldn't shake. For the first time since this ordeal had begun, she felt like something was shifting a small crack in what had once seemed like an impenetrable wall. Langston, seated beside her, tapped his pen thoughtfully against his notebook. His eyes were sharp as ever, as though his mind was running ahead of them, already strategizing their next move. "What Claire told us, that's important," Langston said finally, breaking the silence. "If there's a record of policy incidents tied to Kelly, that's something we can use." Jasmine nodded, though she still felt a seed of doubt taking root in her chest. "But what if we can't get access to those records? It's not like the airline is just going to hand them over." Langston gave her a faint, knowing smile. "Companies like this are good at hiding things, but they always leave breadcrumbs. We just have to find them." Jasmine sighed and leaned forward, rubbing her belly gently. The baby shifted beneath her touch, a subtle reminder that she wasn't in this fight alone. "So, where do we start?" "We look for patterns," Langston replied. "Claire gave us a lead, but we need more. More witnesses, more proof that this isn't just about you." His words hung heavy in the air, settling like a weight on Jasmine's shoulders. It wasn't just about her. She thought about the other women those Claire mentioned in passing, who had quietly walked away because the fight seemed too big, too overwhelming. Jasmine lifted her chin. "Then we start digging." Langston's smile widened just a bit, as though her determination was the exact answer he had been waiting for. "That's what I like to hear." They found a quiet cafe tucked into the corner of the terminal, far from the noise of the gates. Langston set up his laptop on a small table, the glow of the screen casting a faint light across his weathered features. Jasmine sat across from him, sipping slowly from a bottle of water as he typed. "Most airlines log incidents in internal databases," Langston explained, his fingers dancing across the keyboard. "But there's a catch. If the airline receives formal complaints, especially ones filed with outside regulatory agencies, they're supposed to keep a record. Public records, in some cases." "Public records?" Jasmine echoed, intrigued. Langston nodded, his focus never breaking. "If enough passengers have complained, there might be breadcrumbs we can follow. Let's start by looking for patterns of behavior." As Langston worked, Jasmine pulled out her phone and opened her email. Her inbox was flooded with reminders about the conference, messages from colleagues, and a note from Lauren, her best friend, asking how her flight was going. Jasmine stared at the screen for a moment, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. How do I even explain this to her, she wondered. Lauren would be furious on her behalf, but Jasmine wasn't ready for that conversation yet. She wasn't ready for anyone to know how small she had felt standing at that counter. "Found something," Langston murmured, drawing Jasmine's attention. She leaned forward as Langston turned the laptop toward her. On the screen was a list of complaints, dozens of them filed against the airline in recent years. Each one outlined incident similar to what Jasmine had experienced. "Denied boarding due to safety policies," Langston read aloud, his tone heavy with meaning. Passengers described feeling humiliated. Unfairly targeted pregnant women, plus-sized passengers, people of color. Jasmine's chest tightened as she scanned the list. It was all there, spelled out in black and white. A pattern of discrimination hiding behind vague, subjective rules. "It's not just me," Jasmine whispered, her voice almost breaking. "No, it's not," Langston said, his expression resolute. "This isn't just a policy issue. It's systemic." Jasmine sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. How many people had walked away quietly, carrying that same humiliation because they didn't know how to fight back? Because no one believed them. "Why hasn't anyone done anything about this before?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Langston shrugged, though his expression was grim. "It's hard to fight giants, Dr. Miller. Most people don't have the time, money, or support to take them on. That's what these companies count on." Jasmine pressed her lips together, her jaw tightening. "Then they picked the wrong person this time." Langston chuckled softly, though there was pride in his gaze. "I'm beginning to see that." As the hours passed, Langston continued to piece together information, tracing complaints and compiling evidence. Jasmine watched him work, occasionally chiming in with questions or observations. She was impressed by his tenacity, how he dove into the details with a sharp, relentless focus. Why do you do this?" Jasmine asked him at one point, curious. "You said you're retired. You could be anywhere right now on a beach, living a quiet life. Why help me?" Langston paused, his hands stilling over the keyboard. He looked up at her, his expression thoughtful, as though he were carefully considering his words. "Because someone helped me once, when I didn't think I could fight back," he said finally. "And because I've spent too many years watching people lose battles they shouldn't have had to fight in the first place." Jasmine felt a lump rise in her throat. There was something unspoken in his answer, a story she could sense but didn't press. For now, it was enough to know that Langston understood what it meant to stand on the edge of something overwhelming and choose to fight anyway. "I'm glad you were there today," she said softly. Langston smiled faintly. "Me too." The terminal had grown quieter by the time they packed up their things. Evening shadows stretched across the floor, and most of the travelers had already boarded their flights. Jasmine stood, her body protesting the long hours spent sitting, and stretched carefully. "What happens next?" she asked, as Langston slid his laptop into his briefcase. "Next, we file an official complaint," Langston replied. "But first, we need to keep building our case. Claire's tip about the incident log is important. If we can find someone else on the inside willing to talk, we'll have what we need to make them take this seriously." Jasmine nodded, though she felt the exhaustion deep in her bones. The day had been long, and her body was beginning to remind her of how far she had pushed herself. Still, there was a fire burning inside her now, one that refused to be extinguished. Langston turned to her, his voice softening. "Go home and get some rest, Dr. Miller. You've done enough for today." Jasmine managed a tired smile. "Thank you, Langston, for everything." "You don't need to thank me yet," he replied with a grin. "We're just getting started." Jasmine's cab pulled up outside her small brownstone, just as the last light of the day slipped beneath the horizon. The familiar brick exterior, with its warm porch light glowing in the darkness, brought her a small measure of comfort. Inside, the house was quiet, save for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Jasmine dropped her bags by the door and sank onto the couch, kicking off her shoes. The baby stirred again, and she smiled faintly, pressing her hand against her belly. "We're not giving up," she whispered softly, more to herself than to the child growing inside her. "Not this time." Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, jolting her from her thoughts. It was a text from Lauren. "Thinking about you. Hope you're okay. Call me when you can. Love you." Jasmine stared at the message for a long moment before typing a quick reply. "I'm okay. I'll explain everything soon. Love you too." She leaned back against the couch, letting her eyes close for just a moment. Tomorrow would bring more battles, she was certain of that. But for now, in the quiet safety of her home, Jasmine allowed herself to rest. Somewhere out there, the airline was counting on her to give up. But they were wrong. This fight was just beginning. The next morning, sunlight poured through Jasmine's bedroom window, streaking across the neatly made bed and casting warmth onto her face. She blinked awake, disoriented at first, before the events of the previous day came flooding back. The airport, Kelly, Langston, Claire's whispered confession. Jasmine exhaled slowly, the memory settling over her like a heavy blanket. As much as she wanted to push it aside, she couldn't. It clung to her, urging her forward like a voice she couldn't ignore. Her phone buzzed from the nightstand, pulling her back to the present. She reached for it, her body slow with the weight of pregnancy, and checked the screen. "Lauren, good morning. You okay? You've been quiet, Jazz. Call me." Jasmine sighed softly, her thumb hovering over the reply button. She knew Lauren would worry, and she deserved to know what happened, But Jasmine didn't want to relive it just yet. Instead, she sent a quick response. "I'm okay. Busy day ahead. I'll call soon. Love you." Sliding the phone onto the bed, Jasmine pushed herself up and swung her legs over the edge, her hand resting instinctively on her belly. "Good morning, little one," she whispered to the child growing inside her. "We've got work to do today." A few hours later, Jasmine found herself seated across from Langston at a small coffee shop in Midtown. The atmosphere buzzed with the sounds of espresso machines hissing, customers chatting, and the soft clink of cups against saucers. It was busy but cozy, a perfect spot for a quiet meeting away from prying eyes. Langston arrived with his usual calm energy, a paper folder tucked under one arm and a fresh cup of coffee in hand. He slid into the seat across from Jasmine and set the folder down, tapping its cover lightly. "Morning," he greeted, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "How'd you sleep?" "Better than I thought I would," Jasmine admitted. She stirred the tea in front of her, the steam curling lazily into the air. "What's in the folder?" "Progress," Langston said, his eyes lighting up. "I've been up since 6. Let's just say I found us a breadcrumb or two." He opened the folder, revealing a stack of printed documents. Jasmine leaned closer, her brow furrowed. "What am I looking at?" "Complaints filed with the Department of Transportation over the last 2 years," Langston explained. "Some of these cases mirror yours almost exactly. Passengers denied boarding under vague comfort policies, most of them women or people of color." Jasmine's pulse quickened as she scanned the papers. Each one felt like a piece of her own story. Someone else who had stood in her shoes. Someone else who had felt invisible and diminished. Langston pointed to one report near the top. "Here's a good one. A woman 7 months pregnant denied boarding by the same airline. She was told her size posed a safety concern. Sound familiar?" Jasmine's hands trembled slightly as she held the paper. "Why haven't we heard about any of this? Why isn't it in the news?" Langston's jaw tightened. "Because these cases are often settled quietly. The airline offers refunds, maybe a small payout, and the complaints disappear. Most people just want to move on." Jasmine frowned, the weight of his words settling over her like stones. "And those who don't?" Langston leaned back, his gaze steady. "They're buried in paperwork, intimidation tactics, or worse. That's what we're up against." Jasmine felt her anger flare hot, sharp, and unexpected. She had spent years fighting for her patients, for the women whose voices were often dismissed, and now it was her turn to fight. She couldn't ignore the pattern any longer. "We need to find them," Jasmine said suddenly, her voice firm. Langston raised an eyebrow. "Find who?" "The others," Jasmine replied, her words spilling out faster now. "The women in these reports, they've been through this too. If we can find even one person willing to speak up, it'll prove this isn't just me, it's a systemic problem." Langston smiled faintly, his approval clear. "That's what I like about you, Dr. Miller. You don't back down." Jasmine allowed herself a small smile, but her mind was already racing. This fight was bigger than she had realized, and every step forward felt like a step toward justice for herself, for her baby, and for every woman who had been told she didn't belong. Langston's plan was simple. Start with the names they could find. Many of the formal complaints were anonymous, but a few included contact information. It was a long shot, but Jasmine was willing to try. They spent the rest of the day at Langston's small, cluttered office, which sat in a quiet corner of a Brooklyn brownstone. His walls were lined with old case files and faded photographs, reminders of the battles he had fought and won over the years. Jasmine sat at his desk, phone in hand, dialing the first number on the list. It belonged to a woman named Patricia Clark, whose complaint had been filed 6 months earlier. The line rang twice before a cautious voice answered. "Hello?" "Hi, is this Patricia Clark?" Jasmine asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "My name is Dr. Jasmine Miller. I know this might sound strange, but I think we have something in common." There was a long pause. What do you mean? Patricia asked warily. Jasmine glanced at Langston, who nodded encouragingly. I read about your complaint against Harper Airlines, Jasmine continued, about being denied boarding. I went through the same thing yesterday. Silence. Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest as the seconds dragged on. Finally, Patricia spoke, her voice softer this time. They did it to you too? Yes, Jasmine said, her throat tightening. I'm trying to fight back, and I think you can help me. Patricia hesitated again, but when she spoke, there was a tremor of anger in her voice. I thought about fighting them, you know? But I was 8 months pregnant, tired, humiliated. I didn't have the energy. I understand, Jasmine said gently, and I'm so sorry you went through that. But if we work together, we can make sure they don't do this to anyone else. Patricia exhaled slowly, as though she were trying to push out years of frustration. What do you need from me? Jasmine's shoulders relaxed with relief. Just your story, she said. Anything you're willing to share. Okay, Patricia replied after a moment. I'll think about it. Thank you, Jasmine said sincerely. It means more than you know. As the call ended, Jasmine looked up to find Langston watching her with a faint smile. That's one, he said. A spark in the dark. Jasmine returned the smile, her resolve solidifying like iron. And it's only the beginning. The day stretched long into the evening, the sky outside darkening as Jasmine and Langston worked tirelessly. By the time they packed up for the night, they had spoken to 3 women, Patricia, a young mother named Elena, and a retired teacher named Denise. Each of their stories mirrored Jasmine's in painful detail. As they left Langston's office, Jasmine paused in the doorway, looking back at the stacks of paper and notes scattered across his desk. We're building something, aren't we? She said quietly. Langston nodded, his voice filled with quiet pride. We are, one piece at a time. That night, Jasmine sat on her couch, her laptop open, and the dim glow of the screen illuminating her tired face. She read through the notes Langston had compiled, each story blending into the next proof of a problem too big to ignore. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling the soft flutter of her baby's movement. We're doing this for you, she whispered, her voice steady, for a world where no one can make you feel small. The fight wasn't over, not even close, but Jasmine felt something she hadn't felt in days. Hope. And hope, she realized, was the first step toward change. The next morning, Jasmine woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. Still half asleep, she reached for it, blinking at the bright screen. Lauren? Jas? Are you okay? Why am I seeing you on the news? Jasmine froze, suddenly wide awake. The news? She sat up quickly, her heart pounding. Another message came through, this time from a colleague. Dr. Patel. Saw the story. Call me if you need support. Proud of you for standing up. Confusion and dread twisted in Jasmine's chest as she opened her phone's browser and typed, Harper Airlines pregnant doctor. A wave of headlines filled the screen. Pregnant doctor denied boarding due to airline policy controversy. Discrimination or policy. Doctor speaks out after being turned away. Airline faces backlash after incident at NYC terminal. Jasmine's hand shook as she scrolled through the articles. There was no photograph of her yet, but the descriptions were unmistakable. A prominent maternal health specialist, 8 months pregnant, forced to leave the gate. Someone must have seen what happened and shared it online. Her stomach churned. She had spent years building her reputation carefully, meticulously, and now this incident threatened to reduce her to a headline, a talking point for strangers. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Langston. Good morning, Dr. Miller, his voice said warmly when she answered. I see the media beat us to it. Langston, what's happening? Jasmine asked, her voice a mix of anxiety and frustration. How did this get out? These things have a way of spreading, especially when they strike a nerve, Langston replied calmly. People are tired of being dismissed, Jasmine. Your story is giving them a voice. Jasmine exhaled shakily, running a hand through her curls. But I wasn't ready for this. I don't want to be a spectacle. You're not a spectacle, Langston said firmly. You're a symbol. Jasmine was quiet for a moment, letting his words sink in. So, what do we do now? Langston's voice carried that steady determination she was beginning to depend on. We keep going. This attention is good for us. It's going to make it harder for them to bury what they've done. Later that morning, Jasmine met Langston at his office again. The space was quickly becoming familiar worn leather chairs, mismatched coffee mugs, and stacks of paper that seemed to grow overnight. Today, though, Langston's desk was neater than usual, with a file folder placed carefully in the center. "What's that?" Jasmine asked as she sat down, her body already protesting the long day ahead. Langston slid the folder toward her. "It's the next piece of the puzzle." Jasmine opened it, her eyes widening as she read, "Is this from Claire?" Langston nodded, a small smile of satisfaction crossing his face. "It is. She didn't want to speak publicly, but she left us something valuable." Inside the folder were screenshots, incident logs, from the airline's internal system. Each log documented passenger complaints that had been flagged under the vague category of policy enforcement. Kelly's name appeared more than once, alongside similar descriptions of denied boarding for comfort and safety reasons. Jasmine felt her pulse quicken. This is exactly what we needed. "It's a start," Langston said, leaning back in his chair. "But we'll need to present this carefully. The airline's legal team will argue it's a coincidence, just isolated incident." Jasmine's anger flared, though she kept her voice calm. "It's not a coincidence, Langston. They're targeting people like me, pregnant women, people who don't fit their idea of a perfect passenger. This proves it." Langston nodded. "And that's why we need to find others who are willing to stand with you. The more voices we have, the harder it will be for them to dismiss this." Jasmine exhaled slowly, her determination hardening. "Then let's find them." For the next few days, Jasmine and Langston worked tirelessly. Langston reached out to former airline employees, combing through every thread they could find. Jasmine, meanwhile, spent hours speaking to women who had experienced similar incidents. Patricia, the first woman they contacted, agreed to share her story. "I didn't think anyone cared," she admitted during their call. "But hearing what happened to you, knowing I wasn't alone, it makes me want to fight back." A second woman, Elena, shared a painful memory of being turned away while traveling to visit her sick mother. "They humiliated me," she said, her voice breaking. "I just wanted to be with my family." Each conversation weighed on Jasmine, but it also fueled her resolve. These women weren't just names on a list, they were real people with lives and dreams that had been disrupted, just like hers. Late one evening, as Jasmine sat at Langston's desk sorting through notes, her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from an unfamiliar number. "My name is Tanya Lewis. I saw your story online. The same thing happened to me last year. I'm willing to talk." Jasmine's heart leapt. Another voice. Another chance to prove this wasn't isolated. She quickly replied, arranging a time to speak with Tanya the next day. When she looked up, Langston was watching her with a knowing smile. "You're making progress," he said. Jasmine exhaled, a small smile breaking through her exhaustion. "We're making progress," she corrected. Langston nodded, his expression proud. "It's because you didn't give up, Jasmine. That's how these battles are won, one step at a time." The next morning, Jasmine sat on her couch, phone in hand, listening to Tanya's voice crackle through the speaker. Tanya described her experience, how she had been denied boarding on a flight to her sister's wedding, made to feel like an inconvenience because of her size. "I tried to tell them I followed the policy," Tanya said bitterly. But they didn't listen. I ended up missing the wedding. Jasmine's chest ached as she listened, anger mixing with a deep sadness. I'm so sorry, Tanya, she said softly. But your story matters. You matter, and we're going to make sure they hear you. Tanya paused, her voice trembling when she spoke again. Thank you. I didn't think anyone would care, but maybe this time will be different. It will be, Jasmine promised. Together, we'll make sure of it. That evening, Jasmine and Langston sat across from each other in his office, surrounded by stacks of notes, witness statements, and evidence. The room felt heavy with the weight of everything they had uncovered. We're getting closer, Langston said, flipping through a document. We've got enough to file a complaint, but if we can find one more thing, one more solid piece of evidence, it could seal the deal. What kind of evidence? Jasmine asked. Something internal, Langston replied. A memo, an email, anything that proves this was deliberate, not just a handful of bad decisions. Jasmine nodded, though her mind was already racing. Claire had hinted at more information being out there, documents that could expose the truth. If they could convince her or someone like her to step forward, it might be enough to push the airline into a corner. Langston leaned back, studying Jasmine carefully. You're holding up well, you know, he said, his tone softer now. Not everyone could do what you're doing. Jasmine smiled faintly, pressing a hand to her belly. I'm not just fighting for myself, Langston. I'm fighting for my baby, too. I want them to grow up in a world where no one can make them feel small. Langston nodded, his eyes warm with understanding. And that's exactly what's going to make the difference. Jasmine exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the day, but also the fire of resolve that burned brighter than ever. They were close now, she could feel it. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, Jasmine believed they might actually win. Jasmine sat by the window of Langston's office, watching as the late afternoon sunlight bled into streaks of orange and gold across the Brooklyn skyline. Her laptop sat open on the desk, a growing collection of documents and notes staring back at her statements from victims, airline complaint logs, and handwritten details scribbled into Langston's legal pad. The room felt like the calm before a storm, heavy with anticipation. How many women have come forward now? Jasmine asked, breaking the silence. Langston, seated across the room with a mug of coffee, glanced up from the papers in his hand. 4 officially, he replied. You, Patricia, Elena, and Tanya. Unofficially? There's more women who don't want to share their names yet, but their stories match the pattern. Jasmine exhaled, her chest tight with both relief and frustration. That should be enough. How can the airline ignore this? Langston set his mug down, giving her a look filled with quiet wisdom. They won't ignore it, Jasmine. Not anymore. But they'll fight us every step of the way. Jasmine turned her gaze back to the window. She knew he was right. Companies like Harper Airlines didn't admit fault easily. They had armies of lawyers, PR teams, and endless resources to bury complaints under legal jargon and polished spin. Jasmine wasn't naive, but she wasn't intimidated either. I want to go public, Jasmine said suddenly, her voice steady. Langston paused mid-note, his brow furrowing slightly. Are you sure about that? Once your name and face are out there, there's no going back. Jasmine turned to face him, her resolve clear. I've spent my whole career fighting for women who felt invisible. If I hide behind anonymity, how am I any different? Langston studied her for a moment before nodding. All right, if that's what you want, we'll make sure you're ready for whatever comes. The next morning, Langston set up a meeting with a trusted journalist, a woman named Hannah Lee, who had built her career exposing corporate misconduct. Jasmine met her in a quiet corner of a Manhattan cafe, nerves fluttering in her chest as she sat down at the small wooden table. Hannah, a petite woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, extended a hand. Dr. Miller, it's an honor to meet you. Langston's told me a lot about your case. Thank you for meeting with us, Jasmine replied, shaking her hand firmly. Hannah wasted no time. She opened her notebook and clicked her pen, her gaze locking onto Jasmine's. "I want to tell your story the right way," she said, "but I need to hear it from you. What happened? And why are you fighting back?" Jasmine took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking. She recounted everything: the moment at the check-in counter, Kelly's humiliating tone, the stares of passengers, and the way her voice felt like it had been taken from her. She spoke about the other women, Patricia, Elena, Tanya, and the growing mountain of evidence Langston had helped uncover. "I'm not just doing this for me," Jasmine said firmly, her voice calm but powerful. "I'm doing this for every person who's ever been made to feel small. For women like me, black women, pregnant women who are told, directly or indirectly, that they don't belong." Hannah nodded, jotting notes as she listened. "And what do you hope to achieve?" "Change," Jasmine replied without hesitation. "I want the airline to take responsibility. I want them to change their policies so no one else has to go through what I did." Hannah smiled faintly, admiration flickering across her face. "That's a story worth telling." The article ran 2 days later, its headline bold and unflinching. "Pregnant Doctor Speaks Out. Harper Airlines Under Fire for Discriminatory Practices." Jasmine's name and photograph were front and center, accompanied by quotes from her interview and details of the case. The article painted a damning picture of Harper Airlines' vague policies, highlighting not only Jasmine's experience, but the voices of Patricia, Elena, and Tanya as well. The public response was immediate. Social media exploded with comments and shares, many people applauding Jasmine for speaking up. Others began sharing their own stories of being mistreated or excluded by airlines. Jasmine sat in her living room that evening, scrolling through the responses on her phone. Lauren had texted her nearly a dozen times since the article went live, finally demanding, "Call me now." Jasmine chuckled softly and hit the call button. "Jazz!" Lauren's voice rang through the line. "Girl, I just read the article. Are you okay? This is huge." "I'm fine," Jasmine said, smiling. "A little overwhelmed, but fine." "I'm so proud of you," Lauren said, her voice softening. "What you're doing, it's brave, Jazz. You're not just speaking for yourself. You're speaking for so many other women." Jasmine leaned back against the couch, her free hand resting gently on her belly. "That's the goal," she said quietly. "To make sure no one else has to feel this way." "And you're doing it," Lauren replied. "Don't let anyone make you doubt that." The next day, Jasmine received an unexpected call from Langston while she was reviewing notes in his office. "You're not going to believe this," Langston said, his voice tinged with triumph. "What?" Jasmine asked, sitting up straight. "We've got it," Langston replied. "An internal memo." Jasmine froze. "What kind of memo?" Langston placed a printed document in front of her. Jasmine leaned over to read it, her eyes widening as the words sank in. It was a Harper Airlines communication sent to managerial staff, instructing them to closely monitor passengers whose physical appearance could cause discomfort for others. The language was careful, sterile, and vague, but the intent was unmistakable. "This proves it," Jasmine whispered, her voice shaking. "They've been targeting people deliberately." Langston nodded, his expression serious. "This is the smoking gun we needed. If we combine this with the witness statements and the complaint logs, they won't be able to deny it anymore." Jasmine's heart pounded as she stared at the memo. This was it, the moment when their fight turned from an uphill battle to a real chance at justice. "What happens next?" she asked, looking up at Langston. "We file the lawsuit," Langston replied calmly, "and we let them know we're not backing down." Jasmine exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling over her. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time, victory felt close enough to touch. That evening, As Jasmine walked home through the quiet streets of her neighborhood, she allowed herself a moment to reflect. The last few days had been a whirlwind filled with doubt, anger, and exhaustion, but also unexpected strength. Women had come forward, voices she never knew existed, and together they had formed something larger than themselves. She paused at her front steps, resting her hand on her belly as the baby shifted gently. "We're almost there," she whispered into the night air, "and no one's going to make us feel small again." In that moment, Jasmine realized something powerful. This fight was no longer just about what happened to her. It was about what came next, the change they could create, the doors they could open for others. And for the first time in days, she smiled, knowing they were ready for whatever lay ahead. The gray morning sky hung heavy over the city, clouds pressing low against the skyline as if the air itself knew something was coming. Jasmine stood at Langston's office window, watching the occasional raindrop trace down the glass. She sipped her tea, trying to steady the flutter of nerves that danced in her stomach. Behind her, Langston shuffled papers into a neat pile. "The formal complaint is filed," he said, his voice calm and steady as always. "We're officially in motion." Jasmine turned to face him, cradling the warm mug between her hands. "What happens next?" Langston looked up, his brow slightly furrowed as he explained. "Now the airline responds. They'll have their lawyers send us something usually dismissive at first. Then we prepare for a hearing." Jasmine exhaled slowly, letting his words sink in. She had known this moment was coming, yet now that it was here, it felt heavier than she had expected. As if sensing her thoughts, Langston's expression softened. "You're not doing this alone, Jasmine. Remember that." She gave him a small, grateful nod. "I know, but it's still hard to believe this is happening. 1 week ago, I was preparing for a medical conference. Now I'm in the middle of a legal battle." Langston offered a faint smile. Life has a way of changing course when you least expect it. But sometimes those detours lead us exactly where we need to go. The first strike came that afternoon. Jasmine was sitting on her couch, scrolling through patient files on her laptop, when an email notification flashed across the screen. From Harper Airlines. Legal team. Subject: formal response to allegations. She clicked it open, her pulse quickening as she scanned the letter. Dr. Jasmine Miller, Harper Airlines categorically denies the claims you have made. Our policies are in place to ensure passenger comfort and safety. The events you described were in line with established guidelines and do not reflect discrimination or bias. Further pursuit of this matter could result in countersuits for defamation and damages to our reputation. Jasmine's hand tightened around her mouse, the words blurring on the screen as anger began to rise in her chest. Defamation. Damages to their reputation? Before she could process further, her phone rang. It was Langston. "I just got their response," he said, his voice sharp with controlled frustration. "They're doubling down." Jasmine closed her laptop, trying to steady her breathing. "They're threatening a countersuit." "Standard intimidation tactic," Langston replied calmly. "They're hoping you'll get scared and back off." "Well, it's not going to work," Jasmine said, her voice firm despite the knot in her chest. "I'm not giving up now." Langston chuckled softly. "Good. I didn't think you would." Over the next few days, the tension ratcheted up. Harper Airlines released a carefully worded statement to the press, denying all accusations and claiming they were committed to passenger safety and inclusion. They painted Jasmine as an uncooperative passenger who had disrupted operations. News outlets picked up their response immediately, and soon Jasmine's name was back in headlines. But this time, the tone was different. Airline claims discrimination allegations are misguided. Harper Airlines defends policies following public backlash. Social media buzzed with divided opinions. Supporters rallied around Jasmine, praising her courage, while skeptics accused her of exaggerating or seeking attention. One evening, Jasmine sat at her dining table, scrolling through the comments online. Some of them were cruel, sharp like glass against her skin. Maybe she should have bought another seat. Airlines have rules for a reason. People always want to play the victim. She knew what she was doing. Her eyes stung as she set her phone down, pressing her palms into her face. She felt like a woman fighting against a wave too big to hold back. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Lauren. "Ignore the noise, Jazz. You know the truth. So do we. Keep going." Jasmine smiled faintly, wiping her eyes. Lauren's right, she thought. The noise doesn't matter. The truth does. The turning point came when Langston received an anonymous tip. He called Jasmine first thing the next morning, excitement crackling through the phone line. "Meet me at the office," he said. "We just got what we've been waiting for." Jasmine arrived at Langston's office to find him holding a thick manila envelope. His expression was a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "This just came in," Langston said, placing the envelope carefully on the desk. "No return address, no name. But what's inside changes everything." Jasmine sat down, her pulse quickening as she watched him pull out the contents, a series of printed internal emails. Langston spread them across the desk, pointing to one in particular. Incident reporting procedures. Focus on passengers who may affect overall comfort and appearance. Be discreet, but enforce policies whenever possible. Jasmine scanned the words, her chest tightening with anger. They're profiling passengers. And they're doing it deliberately, Langston said. This isn't just about your case anymore, Jasmine. It's proof of a pattern. This memo and everything else we've gathered paints a clear picture. Jasmine looked up at him, a mix of triumph and disbelief on her face. We have them, don't we? Langston nodded, a small smile breaking across his usually stoic expression. We have enough to bring this to court. They won't be able to hide behind policies anymore. The news of the emails spread quickly. Hannah Lee, the journalist who had interviewed Jasmine, published a follow-up story the next day. Internal memos reveal Harper Airlines' discriminatory policies. The article quoted excerpts from the emails and referenced the growing number of women who had come forward to share their experiences. The public outcry was immediate, this time louder, angrier, and harder for Harper Airlines to ignore. That evening, Jasmine sat on her couch, holding her phone to her ear as Lauren's voice filled the line. Girl, they don't know what's coming, Lauren said, practically vibrating with excitement. You've got them backed into a corner now. Jasmine smiled, the first genuine smile she had felt in days. It's not just me, Lauren. It's all of us. Tanya, Patricia, Elena, everyone who spoke up. Yeah, but it started with you, Lauren replied. You didn't let them shut you up. That takes courage, Jazz. Jasmine leaned back, one hand resting on her belly as she looked out the window at the glowing city lights. I couldn't let them win, she said softly. Not this time. She felt the baby shift gently beneath her hand, a quiet reminder of why she was fighting. For you, Jasmine whispered, smiling faintly. For all the people they tried to silence. The next morning, Langston filed the official court paperwork, backed by the evidence they had gathered. Jasmine stood beside him outside the courthouse as reporters swarmed, cameras clicking and voices calling out questions. Langston stepped forward, his voice calm and commanding. Today marks the beginning of accountability. Harper Airlines has spent years targeting passengers under the guise of vague policies. My client, Dr. Jasmine Miller, and countless others were made to feel unworthy. That ends now. Jasmine looked out over the crowd, her heart steady and her voice clear as she spoke. This fight isn't just for me, it's for every person who has been told they don't belong. We deserve to be seen. We deserve to be heard. And we're not backing down. The reporters shouted more questions, but Jasmine ignored the noise. As she stood there, surrounded by flashing cameras and Langston's steady presence, She felt something she hadn't felt since the day at the airport. Power. They had taken her voice that day, but now she had taken it back. The courtroom was cold and formal, a stark contrast to the heat radiating from the steady hum of reporters and onlookers gathered outside. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, painting sharp lines across the polished floors. Jasmine sat beside Langston at the plaintiff's table, her back straight and hands resting on her growing belly. Despite the tension, she felt calm, steady. She looked across the room at the airline's legal team, 6 attorneys dressed in identical gray suits. They sat rigid and confident, their folders stacked neatly in front of them. Jasmine wondered if their arrogance came from experience or simply the belief that no one could hold them accountable. Langston leaned in close, his voice low. "Remember what we talked about. Tell the truth. Don't let them twist your words. You've got this." Jasmine nodded, exhaling slowly. She scanned the rows of benches behind her, where familiar faces sat in quiet solidarity. Lauren was there, a fierce glint in her eye, along with Patricia, Elena, and Tanya, the women who had chosen to stand with her. Seeing them gave Jasmine a renewed strength, like a tether grounding her to something bigger. "Plaintiff, Dr. Jasmine Miller, please rise," the court clerk called out. Jasmine stood, her heart steady despite the weight of every eye in the room turning toward her. She adjusted her navy blazer and stepped toward the witness stand. The questioning began gently. Langston walked her through what happened that day at the airport, his calm tone encouraging her to speak plainly. "I approached the counter with my ticket and ID," Jasmine said, her voice clear and even. "I was 8 months pregnant and had followed every guideline the airline outlined. I had my seat selected, an aisle seat, for comfort." Langston nodded. "And what did the attendant say to you?" Jasmine's throat tightened, but she pushed through. "She told me that passengers above a certain weight needed to purchase an additional seat. I told her I met the guidelines. She dismissed me." "What was her tone like?" Jasmine paused, choosing her words carefully. "Condescending. She spoke loudly, like she wanted everyone in the line to hear, like I was a problem." Langston stepped closer, his expression softening. "How did that make you feel?" The question opened something raw inside her, but Jasmine didn't shy away. "Humiliated," she said quietly. "I've spent my entire life helping people, caring for women who are often ignored by the healthcare system. But that day, I was treated like I didn't matter, like I didn't belong." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd, but Jasmine held her ground, her gaze steady as Langston nodded his approval. "No further questions, Your Honor," he said, stepping back. The airline's lead attorney, a tall man named Richard Collins, rose next. He walked toward Jasmine with slow, deliberate steps, his face a practiced mask of neutrality. Jasmine felt the tension in the room shift, the air growing heavier. "Dr. Miller," Collins began, his voice smooth but clipped, "you've stated that the attendant asked you to purchase an additional seat because of your size. Is that correct?" Jasmine's jaw tightened. "Yes. And you're aware that airlines implement policies to ensure passenger comfort and safety?" "I'm aware," Jasmine replied firmly, "and I followed those policies." Collins arched an eyebrow, as if amused. "You believed you followed the policies, but those policies are subject to interpretation by airline staff, correct?" "Not when the guidelines are clearly stated," Jasmine shot back. "And I met those guidelines." Collins' smirk faltered slightly, but he pressed on. "Dr. Miller, would you say your response at the counter was disruptive?" Jasmine held his gaze, unflinching. "I stood up for myself when I was being treated unfairly. That's not disruption, that's dignity." A murmur moved through the courtroom again, louder this time. Collins opened his mouth to speak, but the judge raised a hand, silencing the room. "Let's keep this focused, Mr. Collins." Collins cleared his throat, visibly rattled. No further questions, Your Honor. Jasmine returned to her seat, her shoulders still squared, her head held high. Langston gave her a quick nod, his pride evident. You handled that perfectly, he whispered. Jasmine allowed herself the faintest smile. She wasn't just holding her ground, she was pushing back. The next witness was Claire, the airline employee who had quietly come forward. She sat nervously in the witness stand, wringing her hands as Langston approached. Miss Claire Thompson, you worked alongside the employee who denied Dr. Miller boarding, correct? Yes, Claire replied softly. And in your time working there, did you observe any patterns in how certain passengers were treated? Claire hesitated, glancing toward the airline's lawyers, who watched her like hawks. Yes, she said finally. Passengers who looked a certain way, pregnant women, heavier passengers, people of color, they were flagged more often under vague policies. And these policies, Langston pressed, were they ever written down, or were they implied? They were implied, Claire admitted, her voice steadier now. We were told to keep things looking clean and comfortable. That was code for targeting people who didn't fit the image the airline wanted. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Collins jumped to his feet, objecting furiously, but the judge overruled him. Claire's testimony had landed like a hammer blow, shattering the airline's facade of neutrality. When court adjourned for the day, Jasmine and Langston stepped into the marble hallway outside the courtroom. Reporters swarmed them immediately, their voices overlapping as microphones jostled for space. Dr. Miller, how do you feel about today's proceedings? Langston Avery, do you believe the airline will settle? Jasmine held up a hand, silencing the chaos. I'm not here for a settlement, she said firmly, her voice clear and measured. I'm here for change. No one deserves to be treated the way I was treated. This fight is bigger than me. It's about holding those in power accountable. The crowd erupted with more questions, but Jasmine turned away, walking alongside Langston toward the exit. Her heart was pounding, but it wasn't from fear. It was from purpose. You're a natural, Langston said as they stepped outside into the brisk afternoon air. You gave them exactly what they needed to hear. Jasmine looked at him, her expression both tired and resolute. I didn't plan to be in this fight, Langston, she admitted. But now that I'm here, I'm not leaving it unfinished. Langston smiled faintly, tucking his hands into the pockets of his coat. That's the spirit, Dr. Miller. They don't know who they're up against. That evening, Jasmine sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her. Her inbox was flooded with messages from friends, colleagues, and even strangers who had seen her on the news. One email caught her eye. Subject, thank you. From a grateful mother. Jasmine opened it, her breath catching as she read the words. Dr. Miller, I don't know if you'll ever see this, but I wanted to thank you. I was denied boarding when I was 7 months pregnant, just like you. I was humiliated, and I never told anyone. Seeing you stand up and speak out has given me hope. You're fighting for all of us. Don't stop. Tara C. Jasmine stared at the screen, her throat tightening. She pressed a hand to her belly, feeling the soft movement of her baby beneath her palm. We're doing this for them, she whispered softly. For every person who thought they were alone. The road ahead was still long, but Jasmine felt something solid beneath her feet, now something unshakable. They had cracked the armor. The truth was coming to light, and she would not rest until justice followed. The courthouse was packed. The air hummed with tension as spectators, reporters, and even passers-by gathered in the narrow hallways and filled every seat in the courtroom. A low murmur swept across the room, conversations whispered between strangers and anxious glances exchanged among the airline's legal team. At the front, Jasmine sat at the plaintiff's table with Langston by her side. Her hands rested gently on her belly, a silent reassurance to herself and the life she carried. She'd spent years advocating for women like her, women overlooked, dismissed, and diminished. Today, she wasn't just a voice for herself. She was a voice for every woman who'd ever felt invisible. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with graying hair and sharp eyes, entered the room. "Court is now in session," the clerk announced, bringing the restless hum to an abrupt hush. Langston leaned toward Jasmine, his voice low and calm. "We're ready for this." Jasmine nodded, her gaze steady. "I know." The airline's lead attorney, Richard Collins, stood first to deliver their final argument. He walked toward the jury box, his movements deliberate and confident, like a man used to winning. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice polished but cold, "this case is not about discrimination. It is about an unfortunate misunderstanding, one that has been exaggerated beyond reason." He turned slightly, gesturing toward Jasmine without meeting her eyes. "My client, Harper Airlines, has always operated with safety and comfort as their top priorities. Policies exist to ensure these standards are met, and my client was simply upholding those policies." He clasped his hands together, his tone softening in a way that felt rehearsed. "We sympathize with Dr. Miller, but sympathy is not proof. There is no evidence of wrongdoing, no malicious intent, only a staff member doing her job." Jasmine's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She could feel Langston's calm presence beside her, grounding her as Collins finished his argument. "We ask that you consider the facts," Collins concluded, his voice ringing with finality. "Not emotions, not headlines, just the facts." He returned to his seat, a faint smirk pulling at the corners of his mouth. Langston stood, unhurried as he walked to the center of the courtroom. He let the silence settle, his sharp gaze sweeping across the room before landing on the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice firm and clear, "my client, Dr. Jasmine Miller, followed every rule. She booked her ticket, selected her seat, and met every guideline the airline published. What she faced that day at the airport wasn't about safety or comfort. It was about judgment." Langston turned toward Jasmine, his eyes softening before he addressed the jury again. "Harper Airlines would have you believe this was a misunderstanding, a lone employee acting out of turn, but we've proven otherwise." He held up the printed internal memo, its damning language now infamous. "This document shows that Harper Airlines instructed staff to target passengers based on comfort and appearance." "What does that mean?" "I'll tell you what it means. It means pregnant women like Dr. Miller, people of size, people of color, anyone who doesn't fit their mold of the ideal passenger." Langston's voice grew stronger, each word deliberate. Dr. Miller was humiliated. She was made to feel small, not because of what she did, but because of who she was. And that humiliation was no accident. It was part of a pattern. We've heard from another women, Patricia Clark, Elena Ramirez, Tanya Lewis, women who stood in her shoes and were told they didn't belong. Jasmine glanced at the women seated in the gallery. They nodded faintly, their faces filled with quiet strength. Langston stepped closer to the jury, his voice softening just enough to draw them in. "This case is about accountability. Harper Airlines hoped no one would challenge them, that their policies, their lawyers, and their reputation would keep people silent. But Dr. Miller is here to say enough." He paused, letting the silence settle before delivering his final words. "This is not just about one flight. This is about dignity, justice, and change." Langston returned to his seat, meeting Jasmine's gaze with a quiet nod. The jury deliberated for hours. Jasmine sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, surrounded by Langston, Lauren, and the other women who had supported her. The minutes crawled by, each second adding to the weight pressing on her chest. Lauren handed Jasmine a bottle of water, squeezing her shoulder. "You did everything you could, Jazz. Now we wait." Jasmine managed a faint smile. "Thank you for being here." Lauren grinned. "Always. You know I don't back down either." Langston paced a few steps away, his hands clasped behind his back. His usual calm was intact, but Jasmine could see the tension in his jaw. They had done everything right, presented the evidence, uncovered the truth. rallied the voices of those who had been silenced. But now, it was out of their hands. Jasmine placed her hand on her belly, whispering softly to her unborn child. "We're almost there. Just hold on a little longer." When the bailiff finally called them back into the courtroom, Jasmine's heart felt like it might burst. She walked in with her head held high, Langston by her side, and took her seat as the jury filed in. The room fell silent as the forewoman stood, holding a slip of paper in her hand. Jasmine could feel Lauren watching her from the gallery, could sense the quiet strength of the women behind her. The judge turned to the jury. "Have you reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," the forewoman replied. She cleared her throat, her voice steady as she read aloud. "In the matter of Miller v. Harper Airlines, we find in favor of the plaintiff, Dr. Jasmine Miller." The room erupted. Jasmine's breath caught as tears filled her eyes. The words echoed in her ears. "We find in favor of the plaintiff." Langston placed a steady hand on her shoulder, pride shining in his eyes. "We did it, Jasmine," he said softly. The judge continued, her voice cutting through the commotion. "Harper Airlines is ordered to pay damages and implement immediate revisions to its passenger policies, including mandatory anti-discrimination training and transparency requirements for denied boarding incidents." Jasmine nodded, her chest swelling with relief. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the change. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing and voices calling out questions. Langston stepped forward first, speaking on their behalf. "Today is a victory for justice," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Harper Airlines tried to silence Dr. Miller, but they underestimated her strength and the strength of every person who stood with her." Jasmine stepped up beside him, her voice clear and steady. "This fight was never just about me. It was about accountability. No one should be made to feel like they don't belong. And today, we've taken a step toward making sure that doesn't happen again." The crowd erupted with more questions, but Jasmine tuned them out. She turned slightly and saw Lauren cheering at the edge of the crowd, along with Patricia, Elena, and Tanya, their faces glowing with hope. "Dr. Miller," someone called out, "what's next for you?" Jasmine smiled faintly, resting a hand on her belly. "Next? I'm going home to prepare for motherhood, and to teach my child that no matter how hard the fight is, you stand up for what's right." That night, Jasmine sat in her living room, the city lights glowing faintly through the window. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the world outside. She leaned back on the couch, one hand on her belly as her baby shifted gently beneath her palm. "We did it," she whispered. "We didn't let them win." She thought about the women who had come forward, their voices joined together like a chorus, demanding to be heard. The fight had been exhausting, painful, and uncertain, but it had been worth it. Jasmine smiled, feeling a quiet peace settle over her for the first time in days. The world wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was a little better than it had been before. And that, she knew, was how change began. 1 year later, Jasmine sat in her sunlit kitchen, the hum of the world outside replaced by the quiet, soothing sounds of her new life. On the kitchen table sat a half-finished cup of coffee and a newspaper. The headline read, "Harper Airlines implements new policies following landmark discrimination case." Jasmine smiled faintly as she skimmed the article, her heart swelling with pride. The changes were real. Clearer guidelines, mandatory staff training on bias and inclusion, and public accountability measures for denied boarding incidents. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress she had helped bring into the world. From the next room, a soft cry broke through the silence. Jasmine stood and walked into the nursery, where her baby lay swaddled in a soft blanket, their tiny hands reaching out as if searching for reassurance. "Good morning, sweetheart," Jasmine whispered, scooping the baby into her arms. The child quieted instantly, snuggling against her chest. Jasmine kissed the top of their head, breathing in their warmth. Looking down at her child, Jasmine felt a deep sense of peace, a knowing that everything she had fought for had been worth it. She had chosen to stand when others had walked away, to speak up when silence seemed easier. And in doing so, she had carved out a better world not just for herself, but for her child and for everyone who came after. "You'll never feel small," she whispered softly, "not as long as I'm here to fight for you." As the morning light poured into the room, Jasmine sat down in the rocking chair, her baby resting against her. Outside, the world carried on loud, bustling, and full of its imperfections, but today it felt just a little brighter. Jasmine's story is more than just one person's fight. It's a reminder of the power we hold when we stand up for what's right. Her courage sparked change, and her resilience inspired others to speak up. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Together, we can continue amplifying voices that deserve to be heard. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, justice, and hope, stories that inspire us to believe in the power of standing up, speaking out, and making a difference. And if you've ever faced a moment where you felt unseen or unheard, remember this: your voice matters, your story matters, and you are never alone. Hit that subscribe button, like, and share this video to support our work and spread this message. Together, we can create a world where no one is made to feel small. Thank you for being part of this journey. We'll see you in the next story.